share this out to the Facebook and Twitter and stuff. If you want to share it, go for it. But it is nice for having afterwards. So, are you good?
I'm good.
Yep.
I can start.
Yep.
I can say the official beginning words now.
They're already here.
Okay. So I'm here to talk about accessibility, obviously. There you go. Okay. If you don't have any idea what that is, like if you're completely clueless, I'll do my best to give like a clear definition here in a minute. But before we get to that, let me start with a bit about myself. Yes. Okay. So my name is Cody Loyd. You can find out information about me on my website, codyloyd.com. You can also find me on Twitter, but I never really go there, so that's kind of useless. But you know, it's a thing. So a year ago, or this time last year, I guess, I was teaching high school band at a small school about an hour north of here. I was about a year into learning the whole web dev thing, just kind of on my own through the internet and resources. A couple of months away from getting my current job, which is not high school teaching, right? Excuse me. And the reason I bring that up is that during that entire year of learning all about web dev and CSS and JavaScript and, you know, that type of thing, accessibility never actually came up. Like, I think I knew what it was in general, but I had no idea like what it actually entailed, right? And I think that's probably pretty common. I see most of you kind of nodding, right? Like, so we know generally what it is, but not actually what it means or what. So that's the stuff that I'll get into tonight. The first time I actually looked into accessibility, like actually Googled it and found out all the things, was actually in preparation for my job interview for the current job. So I had talked to the guy that was going to be doing the interview, and he had mentioned a few things that were going to be like a part of my job where I had to get hired. I do a lot of CSS and styling stuff, so he'd mentioned like Flexbox, which is easy. He mentioned CSS Grid, and that was like a year ago, so I had to Google that one. But he also mentioned accessibility, so I ran home and I typed it into the Googles and learned mostly the stuff that I'm going to teach you tonight, which, there you go, that's why I'm here tonight. I guess the other reason I'm here tonight is because I kind of miss feeling important and standing in front of people from the teaching thing. Right. Because I work at home and mostly, well, I don't see any people anymore. All right, so let's get into it. Accessibility is, I'm just going to read it. Accessibility is making sure that your site and all of your content is able to be accessed by all users, even those that are using alternative methods to navigate your site. Side note, sometimes you'll see accessibility abbreviated with the 11. If you spell out the word, there's 11 letters in between the A and the Y. Whatever. You see that sometimes, so I put it on there. Okay, so making sure that your site and all of your content is able to be accessed by all the users that come to your site, even those that are using alternative methods to navigate your site. So, there are real people that use the web apps or whatever that we create who, for whatever reason, whatever disabilities, and we'll talk about some of them specifically in a minute, can't use a mouse, for example, or have to use some sort of third-party software like screen readers or other things. Braille devices are a thing. And it would be a really bad thing if, for whatever reason, they couldn't go to your site and access some amount of your content just because of the way you designed your site, right? So accessibility is being aware of kind of the issues that surround, you know, what might be barriers for those people, and then working around them. Moving on. Also, kind of making it a little more serious, I suppose. There are an increasing number of lawsuits on specifically website accessibility in the past year or so. I found one, actually this last article here. I'll share my slides so you guys can actually click on these links. I'm not going to go to them now, but these are all links. The stats are for that last, the first half of 2017, there were more than 400 lawsuits for websites accessibility specifically, which is a pretty big deal, right? So speaking personally, I work for Jack Henry, which does banking software, right? Specifically, I work on the online banking bit, which would be like the thing that you guys would see if you go to the bank's website and try to check your balance or make a transfer or something like that. And we don't work for a bank specifically, but like we sell our apps to the banks who put them on their websites. It would be a really bad thing, like a really bad thing, if somebody were to go to the bank website and not be able to like pay their bills on time just because they couldn't click on the link because they can't use a mouse or something like that, right? That's a really big deal. Like that person could get in trouble, and then that person's probably going to sue the bank, and then the bank's, yeah, bad news. So it's important to make sure that all of our content is accessible to all of our users. And that's kind of the topic of the talk. So let's get into it. So the World Health Organization did a study a few years ago. I don't know how up to date this is. It's probably about the same. And they found that about 15% of people worldwide are dealing with some sort of disability. In general, these disabilities can be categorized into these 4 categories, which I'll go through really kind of quickly. So motor disabilities are things like, like not having full range of motion in any of your joints, right? Or things as simple as carpal tunnel syndrome. So things as serious as like full paralysis, like just being in a wheelchair and unable to move entirely. People with motor disabilities might, like I said earlier, have trouble like navigating with a mouse. They can't make those precise movements. So they rely on just the keyboard because it's a lot easier to press a button than to move something in a very precise motion. There are also things like alternative switch type devices, which are just a few keys that can be controlled very easily just by pressing buttons or even with foot switches. And things like that. So the big thing that we have to be careful of is just making sure that our website is totally navigable without a mouse. Like, you've got to be able to get to everything with just the keyboard. And I'll talk about how to do that more in a minute on the next slide. Visual disabilities, kind of obvious. Anything from color blindness to like poor eyesight, all the way up to like complete blindness, obviously. And these people, if they can't see at all, will usually use a screen reader or a braille device, which uses a lot of the same things as screen readers. So I'll be talking kind of specifically about screen readers at the end of the talk. Auditory and cognitive disabilities are a little bit less things that we have to worry about. For auditory, that like obviously people that can't hear well or can't hear at all, we just need to make sure that there aren't any auditory things on our website or things that require you to hear it to get the content. The big offender here is going to be videos. So if you have a video, like some sort of promo video on your site, just make sure that it has captions and you're good to go. Otherwise, like, I can't imagine somebody having, like, you have to be able to hear it to navigate the site. But if you're doing something like that, you might want to rethink it. That could be a big deal if you can't hear it, or if like your speaker gets broken on your computer. I could actually talk for quite a while about cognitive disabilities, but I didn't really have time, so I'm just going to touch on it briefly. Basically, this covers anything from like dyslexia or ADD, all the way up to more severe like mental disorders and that type of thing. Sometimes people with cognitive disabilities will use things like screen readers because it's easier to focus on something being read to you instead of having to read it word by word. It's easier to focus on that type of thing. But again, we're talking about screen readers also later. Otherwise, it's just kind of making sure that your users are able to focus on the main content of the site and they're not being distracted. So like I've seen before a website that had this really strange animated banner. Like it was always just kind of moving up there at the top, like actually moving, which can be really distracting to somebody with some sort of disorder. It's distracting to me, and I don't think I have any cognitive disabilities. So being aware of that type of thing and then making sure your content is clear is all you really have to worry about there. Okay, so again, I said we're going to be focusing mostly on the keyboard navigation aspect and screen readers. So let's move on into it. Excuse me. Okay, so a couple of demos here of sites that like have issues or don't have issues. This first one's actually a good example, so let's go. All right, so obviously this one's a web accessibility website, so I would hope that they do it okay, and they do. Congratulations. So the main way to navigate a website using your keyboard is just by pressing the tab key, right? And you guys probably knew that, especially like you get onto a form, you type your username, press tab, type your password, press tab, or press enter, whatever. And that's how you can navigate most things on the site. So let's go to this website and let's press tab. Here we go. Yes. All right, so the very first thing you see is that as I tab around, it's obvious what thing I'm interacting with at any given moment. Maybe a little bit hard to see on the screen, maybe. But there's this gray ring that dances around, and it's very easy to see where that is at any given moment. These guys have gone the extra step of actually animating that thing, so you can see it zips to the thing. That's not built into the browser. The ring is built into the browser, but they've added the animation, so good for them. Also, the very first thing, as soon as you tab onto the site, they have this link, and it's a hidden link. It only shows up when you focus it. So you go to the website, you press tab, it's the first thing that you focus, and then it becomes visible. It says skip to main content, so if I click that, it'll take us immediately down to the main content of the site, which is really handy if you want to get down to the main content and you don't care about the services or the articles or the resources or the community, and you don't want to have to press tab like 18 times to get down to the main content. They put that skip link in there, which is nice. Okay, so the main important thing here is that everything on this web page is able to be accessed just by pressing tab. Like I'm just sitting here pressing the tab button over and over again, and it's going to everything, and I'm not going to go through all of those links. You can trust me, or you can go try it out on your own. Everything works really nicely. Let's go to another example. The React website. Let's go React. Go ahead and open up this one too, because it takes a minute to load sometimes. All right, let's do the same experiment with React. Press tab. Here we go. Tab, tab, tab. All right, there it is. It's on the getting started thing. Take the tutorial. There's a link down there. There's a link down there. I don't know where it is now. Oh, now I know where it is. Right? Okay, so the problem here is that now I am trapped inside of this text box, and there's nothing I can. So Shift Tab actually just works as a normal tab. The arrow keys don't work. If I press down all the way to the bottom, I can't like arrow out of it. I've tried to find a way out, and like Command Tab just does weird things. It like changes my actual browser tab. You can't like, so in Vim it's like :W, Q. That doesn't work. That just throws an error. So we're like literally stuck. If I literally could not use a mouse at all, I would be just completely stuck. I couldn't see any more content on this page using that method. If I knew how to use a screen reader, I could probably hack my way out of it. But I'm stuck. It like stole the focus, and now I am locked in there. Let's go on to the Webpack website. All right, so this one has a slightly different issue. Let's see what happens. Tab, you can see it? Yep, good so far. All right. Oh, that's nice. All right, so we can search if we want. All good. Focus ring disappears. Press tab again. Focus ring still gone. Press tab again, and then it shows up on the GitHub icon. So let's see what's going on there. So what's happening after I tab onto this search input, which is fine, like there's no ring, but it's obvious what we're focusing on here. The next thing that it focuses is actually that little close button, which is a button, so it focuses it, and it would probably show up, except that if you're not on the search bar, it's hiding, right? So I can click it, it's probably running the close the search box function, but it's not doing anything because it's hiding. If I press tab again, the next thing that it focuses is actually this search icon. However, they have gone in and used CSS to like intentionally to remove the focus ring. So we're focusing the search icon, the little magnifying glass, but you can't actually see it. I can prove that if I open up the console. Just a sec. All right, let me. All right, so that button, if I focus it with the browser, I don't know, it's a little bit small, but they have added outline none to the focus definition on that icon. If I remove it, you can see the little thing shows up. So the reason they did that is because if we go back to the, hello, yes. There you go. It puts this ugly ring around the search box, and they didn't like that because it looks just fine without it. It's kind of ugly. So they just hid it entirely, but that causes problems. Yeah. All right, so that one's not a game changer. It's not like they're not going to get sued for that because you can still kind of navigate. Most people, if the focus ring just magically disappears for a couple of tabs, probably just going to keep pressing tab, and it'll show up again eventually, which is not, you know, it's not a killer. However, the next one is a killer. All right, so this little drop down right here, hover over it, and then you can select like the English version or the Chinese version. There is no way to interact with that without the mouse. So if we tab onto it, oh, I missed it. There we go, tab onto it. That's as much as we can do. If I press enter, nothing happens. The arrow keys just scroll the page. Pressing tab again, and the thing just disappears. Actually, it's going into the mobile menu, which is another issue. We'll talk about that one in a minute. If I press space bar, it just scrolls the page. Yeah.
But I don't think in reality there's an ADA compliant section that says that you have to provide Chinese. So.
No, I was gonna say that. Like the issue here is that I can't. If they had hidden like content of the site, like if that was how I got to like this stuff, you know, these things, they'd have trouble. I mean, this, like, obviously they don't necessarily care whether all of their users can get to the Chinese site. But we have something here that cannot be accessed without the mouse, which is kind of a problem, yeah? All right, let's move on a bit. Hey, if anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to just blurt them out or raise your hand. Yeah, I like doing that. So we can have a conversation if you want. All right, so I got a bunch of code pins. And again, I've put these slides on my website, and I'll share the link with you later. So you can come check them out on your own. And these are all related to that stuff that we were just looking at, focus and making sure that everything is tabbable. First one's really simple. I should have opened that in a new tab. I'm going to regret that in a minute. Yeah, whatever. All right, so basic concept, the tab order always follows the DOM order, okay? So however your site is being rendered, like in the DOM or just in the HTML, which is usually the same unless you got some JavaScript going on, is the way that it's going to be tabbed on the site. So if I go here, I got these 3 buttons. Can everybody see that okay? I tried to make it big and bold enough that we could actually see it. If I press tab, it's going to go 1, 2, 3 as you would expect, but I'm going to prove it because that's just what I do. Yep, if I press shift, I can go backwards, and it goes in order. Okay, so if I use some sort of CSS trick to move those around, so I mean, this is a little bit artificial, obviously. So I'm just using a flexbox command to move the 3rd one up to the top, which is a little stupid. Nobody's actually going to do that. However, if I tab through these, it's going to start on 1 and 2 and then jump all the way back up to 3. And I'm going to prove it. Ooh. Ah, man. Why is it doing that? Okay. So obviously this is a silly fake example. But you can probably imagine, like if you have some responsive site, you have things laid out in one way, and then as the browser gets smaller, you start moving them around. Especially like if you're using grid, it's really easy using CSS grid to just kind of completely destroy and move everything around just with CSS, right? It's really easy these days. If you move things so that they're not in the same order that they happen in the DOM, then the tab order on those things is going to be, well, different, right? So you can imagine, actually I've seen this type of thing as an example, especially, you know, with things like React or Angular or whatever the cool kids are using these days. we have all these components, and it doesn't necessarily matter what order they come in, like in our code, because we're using CSS to pin the header to the top and using CSS to pin the footer to the bottom. So whatever, we can just throw the header and footer on top and then the content at the bottom, right? Like I've actually seen somebody do that. The issue with that is when I start pressing tab, I'm going to go through all the header, and then I'm going to jump all the way down to the bottom of the page and go through the footer before I can actually get to the content. And that could be, well, you're not locking anybody out of your content, but that could be really obnoxious, right? So, simple concept, but it's kind of important. The DOM order matters.
So, okay, question. So we've noticed in the older browsers there's some bad behavior. Have you seen that?
What do you mean?
Well, you actually had to go in and set the tab index to make sure that was resolved.
Yeah, I'll talk about tab index on the next example, or eventually, yeah. So it is possible to change the order that things are tabbed using tab index, which I guess let's get onto it.
It seems like everything like in the last 5 years works great, but anything like before 2008, you may have problems.
Yeah. All right, so I got two buttons here. I got a normal button, just HTML button thing, and then I got my fancy button, which I've made, you know, CSS and a div. All right, so functionally, to like a normal, non-disabled sighted user, these things work the same, and the fancy button is clearly a lot prettier. Like, it's got a shadow and everything. The normal HTML button is not all that pretty, and it can be kind of a pain to style. So I can see how it could be tempting to just use a div and make your button. The way you make them do things is pretty much the same, right? You just select the thing and add an event listener, or you can use an on-click, whatever. They do the same thing, essentially, right? And it works, so I can click my button, and I get the alert. I can click my fancy button. Oh yeah, get the alert. However, this is not accessible, like, at all. So if I go up here and I start pressing tab onto the regular button, it's just going to completely skip the second button because it has no idea that it's supposed to be tabbable. So the focus has actually gone down here to like this footer, the code pin thing, and completely skips my fancy button. So to make something that is not naturally tabbable, so like things like buttons and inputs are going to be like like you could just tab onto, the browser knows about those things. You use the tab index, which is what, is your name Micah? That's what Micah was talking about. So if I want to make this thing tabbable, I just got to set tab index to 0. Live coding is scary. I use Vim most of the time, so I'm probably going to get nervous and start typing like J's and K's all over the place. Otherwise, I'm going to get stuck. Could be bad. All right, so if I add tab index of 0, and then I can tab onto it. That's what that does. So by default, things that are not naturally tabbable in a browser, so like divs, right, have a tab index of -1. It's also possible and go in and put a tab index of -1 on the button, so that would make it not tabbable. And there are some circumstances where that's a good idea, and I'll talk about those in a minute. Okay, so tab index of 0 makes this thing tabbable. You can use other numbers as a tab index to change the order that things are tabbed. In general, unless you have to do that for some compatibility reason, that's a horrible idea. You're going to get confused and have to come back and try to figure out. It's like setting Z index to like 1,000,000 because, well, I can't figure out why everything is overlapping it. Yeah? So as best you can, stick to tab index of 0 to make a thing tabbable. And then I don't use the other values because it's going to come back and hurt you later. I bet you. Okay, so this makes it tabbable. However, we got another problem. So if I tab onto my regular button, I press enter, it's going to run the click command, as you might expect. If I tab onto my fancy button and press enter, nothing happens. Nothing happens because the event listener that we added, or if we'd used onClick, it would be behaving the same way. It's a click listener, and I'm not clicking anything, I'm pressing enter. So buttons, by default, have the logic added into them to listen for enter or spacebar and run the click command. So if I want to turn my fancy button into a real button, and this, even still is not doing it. We'll come back to this one later. I have to add a bit of key. So this is just listening for a key press and then running the click command if the key code is 13, right, which is enter. I think I would also have to do spacebar, but I don't know the key code for spacebar. So anyway, now if I go onto it, it'll run because I had to add the key press thing too. So as a general rule, here's my tip. Just use buttons, right? It can be a little bit annoying to style actual buttons. Just a second. But it is possible to make a button act and look just like a regular div, right? So I've got this little button reset thing. I actually use this all the time at work. We have a little mix-in because we're using a framework that allows mix-ins. So I can just apply the button reset thing to turn a button basically just into a straight-up div, which can be really handy. So if we inspect these guys, the top one is my button and the bottom one is just a div. They look the same, right? They're all the same size. They're acting the same, except that this one is tabbable and has all of that, key press logic built into it. If I'm using a screen reader, when I tab onto it, it's going to say, I'm a button, right? So I know exactly what that is, which is really handy. So even things that don't look just like buttons, it can be beneficial to just make them buttons or use a button as a wrapper around it. So like, for example, in our app, my online banking thing that I work on, we have a lot of things like a list of transactions, and if you click on the transaction, then this little dialog pops up. But they don't look like buttons at all. It looks like a nice little list. So I'm just using code basically like this and wrapping it around like our little fancy, my button component thing or my list item component. And it makes it tabbable without having to really worry about any of the other stuff. So there's that. Just use buttons. Tip number 1, right? All right, these last two are a little bit, a tiny bit more advanced. Just to show the types of issues that you could run into when we start working with this stuff. And this first one is a menu. Okay, so yeah, I'm not going to go back there. On the Webpack website, after I went off of the language menu, the focus went over to the sidebar menu. We couldn't see the thing. We didn't know what we were doing except for the little link indication showed up down at the bottom of the screen like that one is. But we were focusing all of those items. To get to anything else on the page, I would have to tab through that entire mobile menu just to get to it. So this is what I have here. It's just a list, right? List items with buttons in them. I went ahead and used that button reset thing just to show it off. And that's what it looks like. It's a little artificial. It looks kind of stupid. But it works. It does the thing that it's supposed to do. Okay, so these are all buttons. The options are all buttons. So if I press tab, as you might expect, we go through them. If it's hiding, I still have to tab all the way through them, even though you can't see it, to get down to the link, right? So what we need to do is, while that thing is hiding, remove the tab index from those buttons. Because what I want to happen is for me to focus the top button, press tab again, and then go down to whatever else I have on the page, like this link that I've put here. So the JavaScript for that is actually pretty simple. I'll walk you through it real quick. All right, so step 1, I just grab all of the buttons using a query selector. So again, these are all just buttons. In a real app, it would probably be a little more complex than just grabbing buttons, but there it is. I grab all the buttons, and then I go through and set the tab index attribute of all of them to -1. So by default, when the thing is hidden, I press tab, I get the menu button, I press tab again. Since those are all set to tab index of -1, it's going to go straight to the link. Yes. Magic. Okay. Then in my little toggle menu function, I guess I should probably comment that one out. Instead of just adding or removing the hidden class, I'm doing that and then going through each of the items and changing the tab index to 0. Which is, it's pretty straightforward, eh? I can imagine that you could probably think of more complex logic to make this work, but basically all it's doing is when I'm showing the menu, I'm just setting the tab index to 0 when it's shown and setting it back to -1 when it's hiding it. So let me show that off. If I press tab, I go here, and then I jump down to the link. I can go right between those two without having to worry about it. If I click on this thing, nope, hello, thank you. Then I can tab through all of those, as you would expect. Works nice. Next example. All right, so this is another example, like something that I've come across at work. So like my list of transactions on one page, like if you go to a specific account, it'll show you a big long list of every transaction. Well, it limits it to like 50, but like 50 transactions on whatever account. Since all of those need to be clickable, because you can see some more details if you actually click on the thing, to get from the beginning of the page to all the other stuff over here, you have to tab through every single one of those transactions, which is kind of a pain, right? So I've kind of set that up here. Again, these are just list items with a tab index of 0, so they're not actually going to do anything except be tabbable. So I tab onto my first button. To get down to button 2, I have to press tab 13 times. Yeah, which could be kind of a problem, So to fix that, again, it's pretty simple JavaScript. Let me just uncomment it and show you how it works. So now what's going to happen is if I press tab, I select button 1. If I press tab again, it's going to select the very first list item. If I press tab again, it's going to go down to button 2. No. Fail. Why isn't it doing it? What's wrong? Do I have to save it? Autosave enabled. Okay, it's broken. I quit. Oh no, I have to set the tab index. Haha. All right. This is why you don't live code, right? All right, so step 1 is setting the tab index of all of those list items to -1, which I wouldn't have to do necessarily if these, because list items are by their own nature not tabbable. But for demonstration, setting them to -1. Now, okay, thanks. All right, so I tab onto button 1, I press tab again, it goes to the very first list item. If I press tab again, it goes down to button 2. And then if I want to get to the rest of these, I just have to tab onto the first one and then use the arrow keys to get around, which is a lot nicer when you have like 50 things on a page. And they all need to be accessible, but you don't want to have to sit there and press tab 50 times to get over to whatever other options you have on the page.
What if you were on button 2 and you wanted to go up to the last one? So if there were 50 things, you could go to 49 without having to go.
Yeah, this wraps around. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at the code just quickly. So I just put in variables for the key code so I wouldn't have to remember them. So that's all that is. Then I have a variable for which of these list items is selected. So selected, it's just 0. So I'm saving them in an array here. So by default, the very first thing you get is 0 of the array. It's the first list item. Okay, so I grab all of my list items, I save them in an array, and then I set the tab index of the very first one to 0. And then I add a key down listener for right or down. So there are actually guidelines, and I'll talk about where to find these guidelines. There are actually guidelines for how different things are supposed to work in accessibility. And it's normal for these type of things to use either right or down to go through a list like this. Anyway, that's why that is. When I press that button, it sets the tab index of the selected one to -1 again. It increments the selected variable with a little bit of logic to do the wrapping. Yeah. Sets the tab index of the next one because we incremented the variable. So this is now 1. Sets that to tab index 0 and then manually focuses it. And then down here, this is just the opposite for if I press the up key. So that's how that works. Actually, it's pretty simple, but it makes a big difference for accessibility because otherwise I wouldn't be able to either I wouldn't be able to get to these things or it'd be a real pain to navigate around my site. Okay, so that pretty much covers what I want to talk about when it comes to focus issues. Obviously, there's a lot more things. There's some pretty complicated things that we could get into. But the rule of thumb is just make sure that you can actually get to everything on your site without having to click on it or hover it or something like that. Yeah. Let's move on and talk about screen readers. Okay, so screen readers are software that read screens. Magic. Done. There we go. Okay, so built into the Mac, Mac has a voiceover, which maybe you've encountered. There are other software screen readers that you can get. Some of them are free. Some of them are like really, really expensive, like $1,000 expensive. Essentially, they all do about the same thing. Obviously, the way you navigate through them is going to be a little bit different. But for the most part, if your site works with one, it's going to work for the most part with all the other ones. So we don't have to worry too much about it. To turn on the screen reader, I'm just going to use Mac's voiceover because that's what I'm familiar with. You can go to the accessibility menu. There's actually a shortcut, which I'll show you in a sec. If you go to the voiceover tab, it tells you the shortcut, which is Command 5. I can click this button. If I click it, it's just going to start talking to us, which I don't want to do just yet. I'll direct your attention to the voiceover training button. I would suggest spending 20 or 30 minutes going through that because it tells you all of the keys that you need to use to actually navigate. It's not particularly intuitive the first time you go into it. It's hard to know exactly what keys to press to make things happen. So going through that training will really help. Really help. Okay, so let's go to just a random web page. Wikipedia is always fun. Actually, Wikipedia has pretty good accessibility, so it'll be a fine example. Let's go to a random article. Anaheim sports. Nice. All right, so I'm going to turn on voiceover and just let it kind of do its thing for a second. So I'm pressing Command 5.
Voiceover on Chrome, Anaheim Sports, Wikipedia window, Anaheim Sports, Wikipedia web content has keyboard focus. You are currently on web content. To enter the web area, press Control Option Shift down arrow.
Let's do it. Down arrow. No, Control. I press Command. Okay, so basically the way that you navigate around using VoiceOver is they have a concept of like the VO key, which by default is Control Option, Control and Alt. So you press Control and Alt and then other keys to make it do stuff. To just kind of go straight through all of the things on the page, it's going to be the VO key and then left and right. So let's do that.
Heading level 1 2 items, image, Anaheim Sports. From Wikipedia, let's
Right,
jump
you can
to
jump
link,
around.
link, search. You are currently on a link.
If you press Control, it just like shuts it up, which is really handy when you're doing presentations, right? They have the skip link. So like the very first thing that I showed you, the web aim site, the little link at the top that'll jump you down to what you're looking for, Wikipedia has one of those built in. The only way you can get to it is by focusing it. So there it is. Way to go, Wikipedia. I'm proud of you.
Link, file colon question underline, book-new.s, this article, link, verification, please help, link, improve this article by, link, add, unsourced, link. You are currently on a text element. This article is about Disney's Anaheim Professional Sports Holding Company for Walt Disney World-based sports attraction unit, C. You are currently...
Okay, so I can get to every single thing on this webpage, like all of the text. It doesn't have to be tabbable, so I'm not pressing tab, although I can press tab and it'll read the things that I'm tabbing onto. It's going through every bit of text, piece by piece. It's a little bit obnoxious on Wikipedia because they have like 1 million links. If like this paragraph here didn't have all of those links into it, it would just read the whole thing to me. But since we've got them all split up into different elements and their links and stuff, it's going to stop after every other word to tell me, hey, by the way, this is a link. And it's going to read it. Hey, by the way, this is a link. Hey, you can press enter to click this link, right? Which can be kind of a pain. Most screen reader users don't actually navigate entire web pages like that, just using the left and right keys. Instead, they'll navigate using things like headings, which you can do on VoiceOver by doing the VO key and U.
Headings menu.
Okay, so this is just showing all the headings. So headings are like literally the H1 and H2 and H3 tags on your page. Side note, that's why it's important to actually use those things and not just put everything in a div and use fancy CSS. Because the screen reader is looking through and when it sees an H1, it says this must be some important text or an important section. and it's going to put it in a menu, or you can do it without going to the menu, just the menu makes things easy to see. So I can navigate headings in this way.
Heading level 1, 2 items. Heading level 2, contents. Heading level 2, 4 items.
Right, so
heading
I can go down, we can click
heading
one.
level 2, navigation menu. You are currently on a heading level
Yes,
2.
all right, sorry. So anyway, things to note. This is why it's important, like I said, to use like those things like H1s and H2s and Ps for paragraphs, articles, sections, all those fancy things that we got with HTML5, because screen readers actually use those things to navigate around the page. If everything was just text in a div, it would be like impossible to do any of that stuff. You'd just have to literally go through every single thing on the page to get to whatever content you're looking for, which can be obnoxious because
Line selected. You
I didn't mean to do that.
voiceover off.
Thank you. Because without the headings, it's hard to know what the content on the page is, right? So as a cited user, when I go to Wikipedia, the first thing I do is either look through the contents or just kind of start scrolling around, right? This is a short article. Let's find a long article. That's not a long article. Come on. Whatever. Start scrolling around looking for stuff, right? And I'm reading the headlines, right? Is that what you guys do when you go to a web page? You look at the headlines. So we don't want to make our users have to tab through, like, they don't need to know he's a Finnish cross-country skier. Maybe they want to know what he, I don't know. You get the point, right? So there that is. Another thing to worry about is images. Again, I said Wikipedia is pretty good at this. Images should have an alt text. You've probably heard that advice before. This is exactly why. If you go to an image on a screen reader and it doesn't have an alt text, it's just going to read the file name, which could be okay. Or if you use Webpack and it's renaming your assets, it's going to read off this string of like 26 characters, which can be really disconcerting, right? So alt text on images. Let's go back to our fancy button, and I'll demonstrate another thing. Boom. Hello. All right, let me put in my tab index. I intended to save that. 0. Don't really need the click handler right now, so that should do it.
Voiceover on Chrome. Fancy buttons.
Fancy
Window.
buttons.
Frame 0 has keyboard focus.
I like how it
You are
tries to
currently
read
on
the
a frame
question.
0 inside of web content. To enter the web area,
All right,
press
all right. So I press tab onto the button.
Click me button.
It says it's a button
You are
because it
currently
knows
on
it's a button.
inside of a frame 0.
Right? If I tab onto my not button, it's not going to know that it's a button. Here's what it says.
Click me harder group. You are currently on a group inside of a frame 0. To interact with items in this group, press Control Option
Okay,
Shift.
so it doesn't know that it's a button. It doesn't even know that it's clickable because it's not going to go through and say, I wonder if this div has a tab index or something. It just knows that it's a div and it's got some text in it, so it reads me the text and says it's a group. Okay? So, if I want the screen reader to announce...
Tab index equals 0. Voiceover off.
If I want the screen reader to announce that it's a button, you do that by adding a role. So I'm just going to type role equals button. Cool, huh? Now if I go onto it, it's going to say button.
Voiceover on Chrome. Fans click me button. Click me harder button.
Button.
You are currently
Right?
voiceover off.
Sorry. All right, so that's fine. Notice that when you go onto the button, it's actually reading the text inside the button. However, I bet you on your websites you have some buttons that do not have text in them. Example time. So like a delete button that just looks like a trash can, eh? I don't have a trash can handy. Let's use an emoji because those are fun. Boop. Yes. Screen readers actually know about emojis, so this should be exciting.
Voiceover click me button. Smiling pile of poop button. You are currently on a button inside
All
of the
right,
frame.
so
Voiceover
if
off.
this is my delete button, and because of the context, I know that poop means delete, I don't want it to read to my users like, oh, smiling pile of poop button. Or if I'm using some SVG, like in some circumstances, I've heard it actually start reading the SVG code. It doesn't usually do that. If you do it wrong, it does, which is scary. You don't want that to happen. You want it to say delete button, right? So the way you add that is by adding an ARIA label. You have to spell it correctly. Is it L-E or? Now I'm confused. I had it right the first time and I got doubting myself. All right, so if I add that in there, it's going to say delete button. Here we go, let's do it.
VoiceOver on Chrome. Click me button. Delete button.
Yay.
You are current VoiceOver off.
All right, so there are other ARIA attributes that you can use. ARIA label is probably the most important because it's the one that says, read this out loud when you get to the thing, right? Which is probably the thing that you're going to want to use the most often on things like, you know, image buttons or icons or anything that it's not completely clear what it is by the text on the thing, right? The other attributes that you could use are like for check boxes, you can say ARIA checked, and it'll say this is a checkbox and it's checked, or this is unchecked, or whatever. There's an ARIA disabled, which will just say that like this is disabled, so you can't do anything, and things like that. I intended to talk about links earlier. That's a fine question. Thank you. Okay, so there's a bit of debate on this, on when you should use a button and when you should use a link. My take on it is just like pretty much always use buttons unless it's specifically a link. So a link is something that navigates to the like another URL. So if it has an href, right, if I'm going from this to google.com or whatever, then I should use a link. If I'm just like running some on-click, even if the on-click makes it look like it's navigating in my fancy single page thing, it's probably safer to just use a button, unless I want it to say link for some reason. Links are naturally tabbable, so they have the tab in it and you don't have to run it. And if you go onto a link and press enter, it'll run the thing like buttons do. However, links without hrefs won't do that, right? So if you throw in a link because for whatever reason you have links styled up really nicely and you throw the on-click on there, it's gonna act just like a div or a whatever paragraph or a span or something, and you'll still have to do all of this stuff. So if it has an href, links are perfectly accessible and fine. So if you're navigating around, then links are fine. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, so like in your menu example, it probably should have all been links.
Yeah, I don't know. Kind of depends on what you're doing. That's fine. Any other questions? I'm kind of done, by the way. All right, let me go back to my slideshow real quick. Okay, so as I said, there are actually like guidelines for these things, which you can find. I guess I'll go ahead and show you real quick. They're a little bit, well, not very fun to read, but they have guidelines for how things should be. So like in a lawsuit situation, this is probably the type of stuff that like judges and lawyers are gonna be looking at to know like if they have any case. So like, somebody say something? Oh, okay, perfect. So like number one here is that non-text content, so like audio content or whatever, or images, should have a text alternative. That would be the alt text on the image or the captions on the video or whatever. The WebAIM website is a really fantastic resource. They have this checklist, which basically has all of those things, but in a much nicer checklisty form, without all the extra stuff. So I would suggest going through that at some point in your life. Other little resources, Alleycast, it's just like a YouTube screencasty thing. It's put on by Rob Dotson, who's a Googler. They have like 30 episodes, and they go through all of the stuff that I went through tonight, actually. Actually, I stole a lot of his jokes, so whatever. They're a really good resource. They're usually, you know, like 10 or 15 minutes long. He shows a lot of code, and a lot of the more advanced examples, like the roving tab index thing, and then other stuff in that vein. So those are a great resource. And then one thing, I didn't think I'd have time to actually get to it, but I'm just going to show it off very briefly. There are like testing frameworks for this type of stuff. This one is the one that I'm most familiar with. I don't actually know if it's the best. It works fine. It's pretty good. So it's a Chrome extension that adds, well, it adds a tab to your DevTools. And basically it just kind of runs a little test on your page and then tells you any possible issues. So it's not going to actually go through and tab through everything and make sure all of your fancy JavaScript-y things are accessible. But it will check for things like images without alt texts, color contrast, which is not something that I've talked about. But for people with color blindness, color contrast can be a big deal. Like if you have a light blue text on a white background, it can be kind of hard to see, and like even for normally sighted people. So it'll warn you about stuff like that. I find it interesting, by the way, that their website has some violations.
Yeah, but for that, people already have the ability to go into the browser and set the high
That's true. The high contrast mode does make a difference. That's true. These might be false positives. I don't know.
Chrome has accessibility.
Yes, it does, and it does similar to this.
Yeah,
What?
do you know if there's much difference between
I've used it, and it does. So the Chrome, let's see if I can find it real quick. Where is it?
audits, I think?
Audits, you're probably right. Nope, it's over here. I remember, it's on the Elements tab.
There we go.
Okay, so what the Chrome accessibility stuff will do is, like, it'll tell you what the ARIA labels are, like what it's gonna say, so you don't actually have to go on into the screen reader and listen to it ramble on to know what it's gonna say when it gets to your fancy button. And it'll also show you things like color contrast. So, that's kind of hard to see. But anyway, whatever. If I find my button. So it tells me like this is a generic container, so it knows it's not a button necessarily, but it knows, well, okay, I got rid of the role because I didn't save it. It would tell me now if like it had that role and what the labels are and the title and stuff like that. But it's not necessarily going to like look for issues.
I think, check the audits tab. Unless I have done something different with the browser. If you do perform an audit, you can choose. Oh, yeah. Lighthouse does it. Yeah.
Oh, you're right. I have done this before. It was a long time ago. Let's do it.
And I wonder if it does more with JavaScript stuff too.
It might.
Yeah, it's doing it through the, yeah.
Never seen this panel in Chrome before.
I think you have to install it. It's a good place to start, right?
Yeah, okay, so it's complaining that my button doesn't have an accessible name. A link doesn't, I don't have a link. Oh, it's probably complaining about CodePen and not my stuff. So yeah, it does do stuff like that. Awesome. All right, well, that's pretty much all I've got. Again, so these slides are at my website, which is just codyloyd.com/alley-a11y. So you can find these. I don't think the image is actually loaded, but it was just like a background image of my face on one slide. So it's not really all that big of a deal. Does anybody, questions or comments?
So my understanding is, that some companies have settled, and there are those that are doing the whole troll sue thing.
Yeah, that's kind of what most of those 400 are.
Yeah, they're not going after Walmart. They're not going after Amazon. They're going after the easier targets.
Yeah, of course.
Are they really?
Yeah, otherwise it's really too.
So, but really? So
Twice
that's
in 4 years.
so.
Mhm.
But my understanding is, and there are some appeals winding their way to the Supreme Court right now, is that the ADA was not written for the web, and that they have admitted that, and that is the basis for the appeals. And Congress has said yes. This is my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that basically Congress is going to try and tackle it whenever they, get around to doing something worthwhile. And they're going to try and tackle this and take this load and make it more clear how the ADA, so basically a section that would be an ADA, how it applies to the web. Because what lawmakers have admitted was that they never intended the ADA to be applied to the web.
Right,
So and
yeah.
those lawsuits may actually throw out all the previous judgments. Was that?
It's going back and forth.
I think so. I think they're gonna. I think it's gonna end So it'll be interesting to see because we know that we want to make it accessible. We want to do some of this kind of work and be helpful to people, but to what degree do we really need to do that? I think some of these people maybe want to take it to a place that is not even reasonable.
I think a reasonable way to think about it would be to say that everything, like you should be able to do everything on your website, but maybe not like in the same, like, so if I have some fancy pants drop down menu that you can only access with a mouse, if I don't want, like if it's going to be really hard to make that all tabbable and arrow keys or whatever, at least provide links to that stuff in the footer or something, right?
Your privacy policy, your security policy, all of that should be like up front and center, easy to access.
Yeah, I think specifically the one that I read about the most was the Hobby Lobby one. And like Hobby Lobby's argument was that like they should, like he could just call us and get the information, but the contact information was also hidden or something like that. I'm a little foggy on all of the details there. There you go.
They keep away from the lawsuits because they have that function. They can always go back and say, you can always call a call center if you have a problem.
Right. Which in my mind, I'm no lawmaker, obviously. In my mind, that's the same as like providing a wheelchair ramp that's at another door, which is in most cases, that's fine, right? As long as you're not like discriminating.
I think that the other thing you can think of too, though, is a lot of these accessibility things aren't just for people that are in wheelchairs or blind. It's older populations and everything else that's happening where they're your market too. So that's the other thing that they keep talking about is that you probably know at least one person who has a problem, blind, mobile, whatever, and a lot of it's due to aging now. And as the population ages, that all comes back around, and they need to be able to use your website too.
Mm-hmm.
I work at Missouri State, and we also have to follow it because of Section 508. So if any of you work with federal contracts, you're already required to do it regardless of ADA. The Section 508 is going to make you do it anyway. So I think that's another. It's not all one or the other. I guess is where I'm trying to go with that.
Mm-hmm. It depends a little bit, I think, on your audience also. That's kind of a scary road to run down because, I mean, the React web, there are web developers that, you know, don't use a mouse, right? But yeah, depending on your audience, that it could matter more or less, I guess.
If you have a public-facing website, you have non-visual users of your website.
Mm-hmm.
They're called search engine bots.
Haha. Yeah, so that is another thing that I wanted to say, by the way. Thanks for bringing that up. A lot of the things that we do to improve screen reader accessibility also helps for things like search, like the alt text on the images. Like your search bots aren't going to do anything with, you know, 1 to ab34.jpg, right? So yeah, that's a great point.
You can't separate them. Accessibility and search engine optimization go hand in hand.
Yep. All right.
One more question for you. So there's obviously at least a few techniques we learned tonight that are reasonably easy to employ and work. I'm curious, somebody who deals in accessibility a lot, what would be the one thing, the one technique that if magically all the websites in the world had it, you know, that would make accessibility great again?
It's a great question. I think the most important issue in my mind is just making sure that everything is like tabbable, like that I can actually get to everything. And it doesn't really matter what kind of fancy tricks you use as long as everything is on there. So in my mind, I guess to answer your question, like the number one thing that I've told you about tonight is just use stinking buttons. I just wrap something in a button. It's rarely going to be a bad thing if the screen reader says this is a button and it's not technically like a button with a border that looks like a button. That's kind of my take on it. Just use buttons. It makes things easier.
So I can echo that. We have a large number of users that are already able to And this is exactly what he said. He went through it. He logged in and he went through it. He was tap, 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 tap. And he was tapping and arrowing through it. He literally went through our website from beginning to end and did it. And it was like a minute and 15 seconds. Went through the whole process of an insurance quote. With
There you go.
a pretty complex website. And he's just 2 fingers.
Yeah. I would say, like,
we get a lot of feedback like that from older users.
normal, like, plain old vanilla HTML is perfectly accessible, right? If you use buttons, it just works because that's how the browsers were built. Where you start running into trouble is when, like, we use, like, React or something, and we got all these fancy JavaScripty things. Like, they're not even divs. They're our own fancy pre-built components that we've made. That is the stuff that causes trouble. So, like, we use components at the stuff that I work on, and where I have a hard time implementing this stuff is where everything is nested down, hiding in components, right? So we have, like, a button component, but the actual button is, like, way down here, and it's wrapped in all of this stuff to make it look pretty and make it do fancy things.
That's one of the things we've done. We used only pure HTML.
Yeah.
No, none of those parts.
That's what you got to think about, and that stuff's getting a lot more common too.
When you have a responsive website, you might have end up being multiple content to the website. What is it and what is not sometimes.
Yeah.
So that's where essentially how the picture we try and make the Mass Pro accessible, and we stop somewhere at 85% or something. We can't go beyond that because what it complains after that is this is twice available, and it's responsive, so it has to be available twice in some format.
Yeah, that's.
There's a limitation always. No one can go 100% on it, but then the lawsuits keep on coming, and then the choice whether to settle or not to settle. And if you settle once, there's someone else who's struggling again and say, settle once, let's go again.
Mike, I would have 3 things to suggest that are all incredibly easy to do that will improve the accessibility of your website. Number 1, your images should have alt text. If those images are infographics, get them to another page, to a descriptive page. Everything that's conveyed in that infographic, which are great for corkboards but terrible for websites on accessibility. All the information was conveyed on that infographic. What you're having at the barbecue, what time it starts, who the band is, all of that has to be in text so that a screen reader and the search engine bot can find it. So there are ways to do descriptive pages for infographics. Do that. Number 2, utilize headings. Don't use bold text to get your headings. The heading tags are important to screen readers because you can just list the headings. Search engine bots love headings too. They save those and index them better than just bolded text. And number 3 is make sure your link text, the text that is actually links, is descriptive of what the link is doing.
Like, click here.
You should never, ever have a link that says click here.
Good stuff.
Usability studies indicate that most website users scan web pages until they get to the page where they think their final piece of information resides. And what they scan are headings, lists, and link text. And when your link text says click here, you've not told them anything. Or when you've got an accessible screen reader processing it, and it says click here, and it reads to the blind person, click here, duh, they already knew they needed to click it to go somewhere. Where is it going? That's what they need. So those 3 things are incredibly simple. They don't cost any money. They just take effort on your developer's parts. And you will increase your accessibility, and B, you'll increase your search engine optimization results.
Anybody else?
Thank you, Cody.
Nailed it.
That was really good stuff. Thanks again. Feel free to hang out for a little bit. Takes a while to tear down. Nice time to chit chat and everything. Don't forget, the 25th of this month is the Silicon Valley Season 5 watch party. And then April 4th, we'll be covering the Postman app. So thanks for coming out, everyone. We'll see you later.